I'm Dr. Pete Economo, the East Coast psychologist.
And I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin, the West Coast psychologist.
And this is When East
Meets West. Pete, today we're going to talk about two concepts that are related that we have sprinkled in so many episodes here. Hi, Pete.
Hey.
Hi. So today we're talking about flexibility and freedom and the relationship between those two. And, you know, I'm sure maybe some people clicking on this episode are like, what? That's it's very vague or very broad. Though I think they're pretty important concepts that I hope will be impactful to those listening today.
I think it's great. And maybe this is the product of some mindfulness practices. Like maybe, is that what I think like how are you packaging this?
Well, okay. So I'll say a little piece here, and then I would love to go into what you're talking about right now with why mindfulness is relevant. So as we, say over and over again here, flexibility is something that we're trying to shape from a third wave CBT lens, right? Yeah. That we know from loads of research here that the more psychologically flexible we are, and by the way, that includes, when we say psychological flexibility, we're also really kind of encompassing in that, like what we do behaviorally, right? Yeah. So the more flexible we can
and
be.
Think, are we also?
And think. Yeah, it's like all the things that
it's cognitive, it's behavioral.
Yeah, so the more we can kind of like, for better or worse to say, like roll with the punches kind of thing, right?
Amen.
Right? The more psychologically flexible we are, the more the better our psychological well-being is. Basically, like overall, we're more
Who doesn't want that?
Yeah, who doesn't want that? And then the inverse is true. So the more rigid we are, the more psychologically inflexible, that's highly correlated with psychopathology. So, things like mood disorders, anxiety disorders, et cetera, right?
Anxiety, depression.
Yeah.
Right.
So flexibility is something that we're constantly trying to help people move towards, right? Mm-hmm. To roll with the punches. And the thing that Pete and I have been sprinkling in here and there, why we were like, okay, we need an episode on this, is that the more we're able to practice flexibility, there is a freedom that tends to show up in how we live our lives, right? And we talk a lot about values and our ability to make choices that are aligned with our values, as opposed to making choices that are based in fear or doing what feels comfortable.
Right.
So that's my little setup here. So I'm gonna now link it back to what you were saying a moment ago and say, so like how does this come out of mindfulness, Pete? Like, how do you think these
neurologically, so I will probably sprinkle upon a bunch of the different research, but neurologically, we know that the practice of mindfulness meditation creates new neural pathways. It create more dense matter in our tissue, in our brain tissue. Mm-hmm. So those things will lead to a different way. And what I'll say for listeners is like our neurons are like highways in our body. Mm-hmm. And so like each highway you get from point A to point B. Mm-hmm. And so if someone says something to me, I don't like, point B for me naturally might be like fight. Mm-hmm. And then now with these practices, I might create a new way of getting there, which says accept.
Mm-hmm. Like a new neural connection.
A new neural connection that says I don't have to respond to somebody. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, that's always the vision I have when you talk about flexibility. I actually like see, if anyone's ever been to the body exhibit. Did you ever go to that when you were in New York?
Oh yeah. Well, I went in LA.
Oh, my bad. Before you got here?
Yeah. You mean the one where like they have the cadavers?
Yeah, they show all the bodies.
Yeah, I saw it in LA. Mm-hmm.
Oh, how long has that been around for?
A long time. Before I moved to New York, I saw it here.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So like if anyone's ever seen that, any listeners, you'd know that the neurological cadaver is like really fascinating. I mean,
yes, amazing. And I love that you're using the imagery, because I also like to imagine
that's
like
exactly what I see when I think flexibility. That's my point, is that I see those neural pathways. I see that cadaver. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, and so, and what you're saying here is that we know from a Western science perspective that practicing mindfulness literally grows more of those. So grows more neural pathways. And then also we've mentioned this, this is where I get extremely geeky about it. You also literally grow neurons, brain cells. That's a pretty big deal. It's just like, we've said before on this podcast, like lifting weights, you'll increase muscle mass, the cells in your muscles. So you literally grow neurons. Though how about from like an Eastern perspective, how do you think that these that,
Why do I always
that concept.
Is that what I'm supposed to talk about?
Oh yeah. No, we talk about both. But
I
like flexibility, starting with flexibility, because we can move into freedom in a moment. But
well, I would say that flexibility would revolve around our last episode, our previous episode of middle path. It's this idea of not being in extremes. And flexibility requires that I have to say I acknowledge I don't agree with you and still do what you want to do.
Yeah.
Type of thing. And that's flexibility. Like, so in the East, it's just natural to the behavior. It's I think sometimes it's a little triggering for some folks because it'd be like, and I'm this way, like, where do you want to go eat? I don't know. Where do you want to go eat? What do you want to eat? I don't know. What do you feel like eating? Because that creates this flexibility of like, we can go wherever you want to go. Like a meal is a meal. It's about the moment. It's about, spending time with someone that we want to be with, but the food is just secondary.
Right. There's no, there's again, no one right way to do things. No one right way to be. Yeah. Yeah. And I think,
what do you always say? Like no absolute truth.
There's no one absolute truth in the world. Right. No one universal truth. Sorry.
Universal truth.
Yes. No one universal truth.
Right.
Truth. Yeah. Well, and I'll add to, that, and this is, I don't think it's a metaphor I've ever shared with you, Pete. I know. Maybe watch. I probably said it to you and you're like, oh, I know that one.
I probably use it, but go ahead.
Yes. Well, so like flexibility is also, not only is it, obviously associated with psychological well-being, we're talking about new neural pathways. It's stronger. It's stronger than rigidity. And the metaphor that I like to use, and this is going to be a little non-environmentally friendly, so my apologies ahead of time, is I want you to think about a pencil and a plastic straw.
Yeah.
So a pencil on the outside is going to seem like the stronger material, right? But the thing is, and we've all probably done this, especially like elementary school, you can snap it pretty easily, right? So even though it's hard, it doesn't have a lot of give. It's going to break.
It'll break, yeah.
A plastic straw on the outside seems very flimsy, right? But guess what? You can tie up those suckers, again, from a sad point of environment, the plastic doesn't break down, right? But you can.
That's what I was just thinking about, like the decomposing. Like I was thinking, the pencil would just, okay.
I was like, sorry guys, sorry. Yeah, but for this metaphor, everyone go with me on that, right? That it doesn't break that, even though on the outside it seems flimsier, it's actually much stronger than the rigid pencil.
Yeah.
And I think that's a concept that a lot of folks have a hard time integrating. That flexibility is actually the stronger position. Yeah.
Well, I was just reminded too, in the East, we would talk a lot about identity flexibility. So now that you're talking about the outside and the inside, that made me think of that because, and I think I often preach this to students and just to my clients of like, when I die, all my accomplishments, my titles, my identity dies with me. It's not like you don't take any of that with you. And so the identity flexibility is also a critical piece because that's something we're usually attached to internally.
Yeah, well, because what do we like to do as humans? Our brains want to attach to like one story, one narrative, one way of being. And it's this idea that like we can be many things and like we can be many things in different moments,
Yeah.
Well, so how then for you, Pete, does this concept of freedom factor in here? Like, because, and, we just to, I guess, preface that by saying like, for doing this episode, we were talking about, is this episode going to be called Freedom and Flexibility or Flexibility and Freedom? And Pete and I were like, no, it's flexibility and freedom. It's the flexibility that's the gateway to being free.
Entirely. And so freedom, by Oxford's definition.
I'm curious. I'm wondering if this definition is going to align with what we're talking about.
We'll see.
We'll see.
If not, we'll just judge it. So the power or right to act, speak, or think as one wants without hindrance or restraint. So I do like that. And obviously from like a social perspective, we want to be like, okay, there's, freedom with limits.
Yes. Or freedom with boundaries.
Freedom with boundaries. And that's like we talk about like compassion with boundaries.
Yes, compassion is.
I mean, probably we could put any verb or feeling and say with boundaries.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty sweet dialectic there, right?
There it is.
Yeah.
So we like this definition because I think flexibility gives it that, like, because the hindrance or restraint is usually what we is self-imposed. I mean, how many clients have we had that really are, imposing their own barriers,
like their own set of rules or no, absolutely. And Yeah, we'll probably have to do, of course, I'm like thinking ahead going like, oh, we're probably gonna have to do a flexibility and structure episode at some point too. But yeah, no, that's exactly right. That the rules that we set up for ourselves, and these rules may be ones we've created in our own minds. They may be ones that we've learned from our families or our cultures. Yeah, that there's those set of rules can get in the way of this recognition that, we just said it a moment ago, there's no one right way to do things. There's no one right way to be. That actually allowing yourself the flexibility to do something in a different way is going to, like, very literally, like, free you up.
Yeah. And I just want to make space of, in season 1, episode 4 and episode 22, we talked about like social inequities and race and power.
Yes.
And I think, what we're saying here is from like a privilege perspective too, because when I say something like it's self-imposed, there's truth to that. That's right. And even people that are disempowered self-impose with these rules and these restraints. And the system is another level of imposed restraint actually on, certain behavior. So this is not like survival of the fittest. Like this is,
No, right. Yeah. And we're also, and I guess related to that, to be clear, in this episode, when we're using the word freedom, we're not talking about like freedom in terms of like if someone's imprisoned or incarcerated, or someone is listening maybe in a country where you have different
communists or like
or different civil liberty, less rights, right? Yeah. So that's I think that's important to distinguish.
That was really important. Yeah.
Right. So when we're talking about freedom in this episode, we're talking about the freedom you have in terms of your own life. And actually, I'm gonna share this example because I haven't I don't think I've talked about this. When I met Pete, we met on internship. I've talked about that. Yeah. And part of my training was I worked as a therapist in a men's prison in Newark. Yeah. And there were a lot of men there that, obviously had been incarcerated for a long time. And we can, of course, talk about another episode, some of the major social issues associated with that.
The disproportion. Yes. We'll bring an expert on for that. Yeah.
Yeah. But what's coming to my mind now is, and this came up in therapy a lot for people that especially were incarcerated for a long time. They had like 20, 30-year sentences. How could they make meaning of the life that they had, even within and we would talk very literally like about the walls that they.
Well, I would imagine, and then thus the word freedom would likely be pretty triggering, right?
Correct. Well, it wasn't. It was interesting because I'm trying to think back. I'm like, I don't actually know if I used the word freedom or if that was the word other colleagues there used, but it was this idea about. I think the word we used is flexibility. It was about like you still within the constraints of this life. Yeah. Within the choice you have, what you choose your values. Yeah. You choose the behaviors that you do here. Right. Right. And there were guys that, went on and, they got degrees there, or they got really, there was a group a literature group that had been running for like 10 years. And they talked about, cool. It was really cool. But anyway, I share that example just to say that that's what we're talking about in terms of this type of freedom, right? Yeah. I don't know if you would define that another way or add to that.
No, I think that's a really great example, and brings us back to our days of meeting, which is which is really interesting to think of you inside that prison, because I know you and I talked a lot about that both during and after, and so trying to set it up, and it's not easy. Like even if anyone listening has ever had a loved one who is incarcerated, or even like an inpatient unit, you really feel like you don't have any freedom, and what we always have is at least freedom to determine how we respond, how we feel, what our next step, in which direction that looks like it's going.
Yes. And I think, and that would be also, so like that example would be applicable if we have somebody listening in, they're in a country or culture where they have different types of civil liberties or rights, or we could even apply this, like if you're in a family or another system where there are extreme limits being placed on you. It's like, and I'm not saying any of this to be clear to say like, don't fight back against these systems. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is like in a moment when you're within those types of constraints, we always have the freedom to choose what's meaningful to us. Yes. And that's like a really, to me personally, like that's very powerful.
It's beautiful. And that's why we need our episode on values. So listeners, you will get that.
Yes, you will. You will get that. It's coming. It's coming. Really, it's coming.
Yeah.
Well, so Pete, I'm wondering, like, is that does the word freedom come up at all, like in Buddhist, teachings, thought? Like,
I mean, it would be exactly how you're describing it in terms of like, you are always free of yourself. Because there is no self. So that really the non-attachment creates freedom entirely.
Say more about that, because I think, again, we've talked before, I think non-attachment is a concept that can get a little tricky for people. Yeah.
Well, it's tricky for all of us.
Yeah. Right. Fair. Yeah. Touche. Yeah.
It really is. I mean, even as someone who studies this stuff and practices it, I mean, freedom is the idea that I'm, because I'm a prisoner of myself when I'm attached to my identity, when I'm attached to my feelings, my materials, and so the running joke in my house is like, if you're not bolted down, I could potentially get rid of you because I really do love like,
that gets me. That's hilarious.
Just getting rid of things because what you learn in this practice is that nothing around us means anything. And that's not attachment.
And then this is I think this is where it can get really tricky. And we can give it meaning. That's the freedom, right? We choose, right? What we connect, right? Because connection's real.
Well, but so the other piece of the not being bolted down to give is also that's really in the Buddhist teachings where freedom starts. It starts with generosity. So there's
I love that. Oh, I love that.
So there's this word, I think it's called dana or dana. I don't know how, in Sanskrit.
Yes.
Yeah. But that is this idea of generosity. And so like, when I have like my nieces or nephews around or godchildren, I'm always teaching them of like, so here's a simple example. Like if 20% is $5, like maybe once in a while, I'll give you $6 or $7. And I actually did it with my godson the other day. I said, how much you think we should give him? And, we talked about how just giving a little extra really, if I can afford to do that, helps, paying it forward. We talk about that in terms of karma.
Yes.
But generosity doesn't have to be monetary. Like generosity could be holding the door for people, smiling at someone who looks like they're unhappy. There's
just kindness, lots
kindness,
of generosity of spirit.
Just sharing as much as you can, empathy, sharing sympathy, just being able to be with other people. And I feel like that's really my dharma. Like that's my, career is about, being with people, clinically, obviously through their suffering, but also then taking that one step further and empowering those that maybe have lost their voice or have lost their direction.
Yeah. I mean, thank you for sharing that. And this is where I love, learning from Pete, because as I've said many times, I'm, kind of joke I'm Buddhist informed, though I'm not, I've not studied Buddhism even close to the level that Pete has. And so like to hear that part of freedom from a Buddhist lens is rooted in generosity. That makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I think that's a very lovely concept. I'm also just, because I know we're going to wrap up here in a moment. I think the last concept that I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on, because I do think this is also related, and we talked about this in our uncertainty episode last season, is the freedom that comes along when we accept.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. And acceptance is also linked to flexibility. So I'm just wondering, like, what, sort of what's your take on that, or what would, Buddhist lens say?
Well, so uncertainty, that was episode 17, season 1. And we also had several on acceptance. I mean, it's just about that whatever's thrown at us is at us, I mean, you can't make sense of things, so one of the things I often teach is like eliminating the question why. Yeah. So we know that from a behavioral perspective, that's judgmental, but also like with curiosity, you just want to know why, right? Like I have a scientist inside of me, like that's part of what led me to get a PhD and to do the doctoral work that I did. And now my research, I want to know why a lot of times. And if I can just release why, I can just accept, then I can just be with what is.
Yeah, that's I've never heard you frame it that way before, and I find that very helpful because we talk about curiosity a lot. It's like when I'm teaching people about curiosity, I'm doing what you're doing too. Is I'm actually trying to help people let go of the why, the problem solving, the future, right? And use curiosity in a mindful way of it's not why, it's just observing, like just taking in the data. And often I'll say to people, which a mentor of mine said once, I found very helpful, the answer will declare itself, right? Like once you have enough information, and that's something and the reason I bring in uncertainty is because when we really truly radically accept that we don't control or know what's on the other side of this moment, there is freedom to do what you want to do in this moment.
That's right.
Like to make the choices, and those behaviors can be both covert, right? Like how you're talking to yourself, the values you're connecting with, or overt. So, I'm sure we'll be talking about these concepts over and over again in future episodes.
We see that it all links. I mean, I think it's really interesting that we, do things in season 1 and now season 2, and just realizing that there is a lot of overlap, but just be mindful that like we can never learn too much. Like that beginner's mind is always an important piece of any kind of mindful journey.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Pete. I've learned a lot from you as per usual. And for our listeners, I really encourage you to think about where can you practice more flexibility in your life, both again internally and overtly externally in the world. And I encourage you to get curious and see, does that help you create more space and freedom in your own life? This has been When East Meets West. I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin.
And I'm Dr. Pete Economo. Be present, be brave. This has been When East Meets West. All material is based on opinion and educational training of Drs. Pete Economo and Nikki Rubin.
Content is for informational and educational purposes